A boot came down on a man's wrist and pinned it to the gravel. He screamed. Another man swung a tire iron at the back of a silver-haired head. The old man ducked, caught the arm mid-swing, and snapped it sideways. A body hit the dirt. Then a second. Then a third. 6 of them had come out of the bar looking for a fight. Now 3 were down and the rest had stopped moving. Blood ran from a cut above the old man's eye. He didn't wipe it. He just stood there in the rain, breathing slow, waiting to see who was stupid enough to be next. His name was Wade Coburn. The bikers who rode with him called him Diesel. 30 years he'd been feared on these roads. Nobody had ever beaten him. What could make a man like that go soft? Stay with me on this one. Now let me take you back, because that fight in the rain didn't come out of nowhere. Nothing ever does. To understand why a man like Diesel would stand in a parking lot and break bones for another human being, you've got to understand what walked into his life a few months before. Or rather, who. Every morning at 6, a chrome and black motorcycle rolled into the gravel lot of a little roadside diner just off Route 58, out past Barstow where the desert goes flat and mean. The bike was old and loud and polished like a mirror. The man who climbed off it was old too, in his own way. 61 years on this earth, and every one of them showed on his face. Silver beard down to his chest, hands like leather gloves that never came off. On his back he wore a cut, a leather vest covered in patches, and if you knew what those patches meant, you crossed the street. Hell's Angel, 30 years deep. He'd ride in, and behind the bike, keeping pace like he'd done it 1,000 times, came a dog. A German shepherd, gray around the muzzle, missing his back left leg. He ran on 3 and never seemed to notice he was short one. His name was Gunner. Diesel had found him half dead in a ditch 4 winters back, carried him 40 miles in his jacket, and paid a vet more than he'd ever paid for anything. The 2 of them had been inseparable since. A broken old outlaw and a broken old dog. They fit. Diesel would push through the diner door and the bell over it would jingle, and the truckers and the ranch hands who filled those booths would go quiet for just a second. Not out of respect, out of caution. Then he'd take the same stool at the end of the counter, and Gunner would fold himself down underneath it, and the world would go back to normal. He never said much. He ordered coffee, black, and eggs, and he ate slow, and he left cash on the counter, and he never once caused a bit of trouble in that place. But people knew. You could feel it on him, the way you can feel heat off a stove without touching it. This was a man who had done things. A man who had buried friends and buried worse. A man the law had a folder on, thick as a phone book. He carried all of it quiet, and he expected the world to keep its distance. Most of it did. She didn't. Her name was Della Prescott. 26 years old, small, with brown hair she kept tied back and a smile she handed out to everybody like it cost her nothing. She'd started at the diner that spring. And from the very first morning, she treated Diesel like he was just a man who wanted his coffee hot. "Morning, sugar," she said that first day, filling his cup before he asked. He grunted. Most people took the hint. She didn't. "You want cream?" "No, you look like a black coffee man." "I had a feeling." He looked up at her, and for a second she saw something cross his face, surprise maybe, that anybody was talking to him at all. Then he looked back down at the counter. She didn't stop. Every morning after that she filled his cup, and every morning she said something. About the weather, about the desert, about the dog, especially the dog. She'd crouch down right there on the diner floor, in front of a man other grown men were scared of, and she'd scratch Gunner behind the ears and coo at him like he was a puppy. And Gunner, who didn't warm to anybody, would thump his tail against the tile and lean into her hand. That got to Diesel more than anything. The dog knew people. The dog had been right about people his whole life. And the dog liked her. "He don't do that," Diesel said one morning, watching. First full sentence he'd said to her in 3 weeks. "Do what?" "Let strangers touch him." She looked up and smiled. Guess I'm not a stranger then. He didn't have an answer for that. He went back to his eggs. Here's the thing you have to understand about a man like Diesel. Kindness scared him, not fists, not knives, not a room full of angry men. He'd faced all of that and never blinked. But a young woman calling him sugar and meaning it, refilling his cup with a smile, remembering that he liked the corner stool and the window seat and that Gunnar got a strip of bacon on Sundays. That got under his armor in a way violence never could. Because he didn't understand it. And a man who spent his whole life reading danger doesn't know what to do with something he can't read. So he did what men like him do. He decided it wasn't real. He decided she was young and soft and didn't know any better, and that one day she'd figure out what he was and the smile would go cold and she'd keep her distance like everybody else. He waited for that day. Part of him wanted it. It would be simpler. But the weeks went by and it never came. She just kept being kind. And every single day, Wade Diesel Coburn, the most feared man on that stretch of highway, sat on a stool and let a young waitress crack him open a little more, and hated himself for how much he looked forward to 6 in the morning. Then came the rain. It doesn't rain much out in that part of the desert. When it does, it comes hard and sideways and turns the roads to grease. That night it came like the sky had a grudge. Diesel wasn't supposed to be there. It was near closing, almost 10, and he'd ridden through the storm anyway, soaked to the bone because his little house out on the county road had gotten too quiet and too empty and he couldn't stand it. He didn't tell himself why he really came, but he came. The diner was near empty. One trucker in a far booth half asleep, and Della behind the counter wiping it down, the neon sign in the window humming and buzzing and throwing pink light across her face. She looked up when the bell rang. Diesel, Lord, you're soaked. Sit down, I'll get you a towel. He sat. Gunnar shook himself off by the door and limped to his usual spot. Della came back with a towel and a cup of coffee he hadn't asked for, and she set them both down in front of him, and she stood there a second, closer than the counter usually kept them. And something in him just broke loose. Maybe it was the rain. Maybe it was the empty house. Maybe it was 30 years of being alone catching up all at once. But he heard himself say the thing he'd been holding back for months. Why do you do this? She tilted her head. Do what? This, he gestured at the coffee, the towel, her. The sugar, the dog, being nice to me. You don't know me, girl. You got no idea what I am. I know you tip too much. And you love that dog more than you love yourself. I'm serious. His voice dropped rough. You're a good kid. You got a whole life. And you're spending your smiles on a broken old outlaw who's done things that keep you up nights. You're too sweet for an old hell's angel, Della. Way too sweet. You ought to point that somewhere it'll do you some good, not at me. He said it hard on purpose. He wanted her to flinch. He wanted her to finally see the shape of him and step back, the way everybody stepped back, so he could stop hoping for something he had no right to hope for. She didn't step back. She leaned in. Both hands flat on the counter, close enough that he could see the pink neon in her eyes, and she dropped her voice low, barely above the hum of that sign. To me, she said, you're perfect. Diesel didn't move. Didn't breathe. Under the stool, Gunnar's tail thumped once against the floor, slow and certain, like the old dog had known this was coming all along. You don't mean that, he finally said, and his voice wasn't hard anymore. It cracked right down the middle. I've never meant anything more in my life. She reached across the counter and put her small hand over his big scarred one. He looked at it like he didn't know what it was. I've been waiting for you a long time, Wade, longer than you know. He should have asked what she meant right then, longer than you know. But he was a man who'd never once been touched gently, and he was drowning in it, and he couldn't find the words. So the two of them just stayed like that, her hand on his, the rain hammering the roof, the neon buzzing pink. The trucker in the corner snored. Gunner sighed and closed his eyes. For the first time in 30 years, Diesel felt something loosen in his chest, something that had been clenched so long he'd forgotten it was there. He felt, God help him, safe. He felt like maybe the fighting was over. Like maybe a man could set the weight down and just be warm and dry and held by somebody who chose him. He was wrong. But for about 90 seconds in that quiet diner, he let himself believe it. The bell over the door rang. 3 men came in out of the rain. Big men, younger, leather and denim and colors on their backs, but not his colors. A different crew, a rougher outfit that ran meth up and down the 15 and had been muscling into territory that wasn't theirs. Diesel knew the type on sight. He'd been the type, a long time ago. The lead one had a shaved head and a chain wallet and eyes that went straight to the patches on Diesel's cut and lit up like Christmas. "Well, hell," the man said, grinning. "Look what the rain washed up. You're Coburn, Diesel Coburn, the old ghost himself." He looked back at his 2 friends. "This is him. This is the one they all talk about." Diesel didn't turn around all the way. He just said quiet, "You're leaving now." "See, I don't think we are." The man walked closer and his eyes slid off Diesel and onto Della, and they stayed there, and his grin got uglier. "Diner's still open, and your little friend here's gonna pour us some coffee. Ain't you, sweetheart?" And just like that, everything changed, because it wasn't about Diesel anymore. It wasn't about his reputation or some young punk wanting to make a name by taking down the legend. Those were games Diesel understood. He'd have let them run their mouths, walked out into the rain, avoided the trouble because trouble followed him everywhere and he was tired of it. But the man was looking at Della, and there were 3 of them. And it was closing time, and the roads were empty, and the nearest sheriff was 40 minutes out. This wasn't a fight over pride. This was something else, something with teeth, and every instinct Diesel had spent 30 violent years sharpening woke up at once and told him the same cold thing. They didn't plan on leaving witnesses. Diesel stood up off the stool. "Now, before I tell you what happened next, let me say this. If you've made it this far, if you're feeling for this old man and this girl, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Stories like this one, about the people the world writes off and the second chances they never saw coming, that's all we do here. Your support keeps them going. All right. Back to that diner and the 3 men who just made the worst mistake of their lives. "Della," Diesel said calm, not taking his eyes off the men. "Go in the back now. Take the dog." She didn't move. "Wade. Go." The bald man laughed. "She's not going anywhere, and neither are you, old-timer. You know how many favors we'd be owed if we walked in and said we put down Diesel Coburn. You're worth more on your back than you ever were on your feet." That's when it started. The bald man reached for Della across the counter. Diesel caught his wrist before the fingers ever touched her, and I mean he caught it and folded it back the wrong way until something popped, and the man went down screaming, and it was on. The second one came in swinging a bottle. Diesel took the hit on his shoulder, felt the glass shatter, felt the sting, and drove his elbow into the man's jaw so hard it lifted him off his feet. The third one, the smart one, hung back and pulled a knife. Diesel had been cut before. Plenty. He knew the trick of it. You don't watch the blade, you watch the shoulder. He watched the shoulder, and when it dropped, he stepped inside the swing, trapped the arm, and used the man's own momentum to run him head first into the corner of the counter. The knife skittered across the floor. Gunner, 3 legs and all, snatched it up in his teeth and dragged it under a booth where nobody could reach it, then turned and stood in front of Della, hackles up, growling low, an old broken dog turned to iron. But 3 young men are 3 young men, and Diesel was 61. The bald one got up, cradling his ruined wrist, and drove a fist into the old man's ribs. Diesel felt one crack. He grunted and came back with a headbutt that split the man's eyebrow and sent blood sheeting down his face. The bottle man was up again too, and he grabbed a napkin dispenser and swung it into the side of Diesel's head. The cut above his eye opened. Blood ran into it. The world went half red. This is the part from the very beginning, you understand. This is the rain and the blood and the old man swaying on his feet. Except now you know it wasn't a bar. It was a diner, and it wasn't for his pride. It was for her. They pushed him back out the door into the parking lot, into the storm, all three of them, and for a second it looked bad. Real bad. He was outnumbered and hurt and old, and they smelled it. They came at him together. And something happened to Diesel out there in the rain. He stopped being tired. He stopped being 61. Every fight he'd ever survived, every friend he'd ever buried, every year he'd spent as the most dangerous man on that highway, all of it came up through him at once, and he became for about 30 seconds exactly the thing the legends said he was. He caught the tire iron mid-swing and snapped the arm holding it. He put a boot on a wrist and pinned it to the gravel. One body hit the dirt. Then a second. Then a third. When it was over, all three of them were down and groaning in the mud, and Diesel stood over them, blood running from the cut above his eye, breathing slow, not wiping it, waiting to see if any of them was stupid enough to get up. None of them were. He looked down at the bald one, the leader, the one who'd reached for Della. He crouched, grabbed a fistful of the man's collar and pulled him up close. "You listen to me," he said, and his voice was the quietest it had been all night, which made it the most terrifying. "You crawl to your bikes. You ride out of this county, and you tell every single one of your friends who Diesel Coburn is, and you tell them what's under his protection now. Because if I ever see one of you near this diner again, near that girl, they won't find you." He let go. The man scrambled back like a crab. "Now get gone." They got gone. Two of them dragged the third. Their bikes coughed to life and vanished into the rain, and the parking lot went quiet except for the storm and the buzz of that neon sign. Diesel stood there another minute, swaying. His ribs were screaming. His head was pouring blood. His hands were torn up. And he felt under all the pain the old familiar sickness of it, the violence. The thing he'd spent his whole life doing and his whole life wanting to be free of. He'd let her see it now. She'd seen what he really was. Now she'd know. Now the smile would go cold, the way it always did, and he'd lose the one warm thing he'd found in 30 years, and it was his own fault for hoping. He heard the diner door open behind him. He didn't turn around. He couldn't watch her be afraid of him. "Go back inside, Della," he said. "Call the sheriff. I'll be gone before he gets here. You won't have to see me again." Her footsteps came across the gravel, not away from him, toward him. And then her hands were on his arm, turning him around, and her face in the pink neon wasn't afraid. It was streaming with tears, and it wasn't afraid at all. "You're hurt," she said. "You stupid, brave, wonderful man, you're hurt. Come inside. Come inside right now." She sat him down on his stool, and she cleaned the cut over his eye with a wet towel, and she wrapped his knuckles, and she pressed a bag of frozen fries to his ribs. And the whole time her hands were shaking and her tears were falling. And he watched her, this girl, tending to a monster, and he couldn't make sense of it. "You should be scared of me," he said quietly. "You saw what I did. I saw you save my life." She pressed the cloth to his brow. "There's a difference. There's always been a difference. You just never learned it." "Why?" It came out of him like a wound. "Why me, Della? You could have anybody. Why would you wait for an old broken man who does this? Who is this? What could you possibly? Why me?" And she stopped. She set the towel down. She reached into the collar of her shirt and pulled out a chain that had been hidden there the whole time, tucked away where nobody could see it. On the end of it hung a small, tarnished medallion, a St. Christopher, the patron saint of travelers. And Diesel looked at it, and the color drained out of his face because he knew that medallion. He'd know it anywhere. He'd held it in his own hand a long, long time ago. "Where?" he said, and his voice had gone to nothing. "Where did you get that?" "Route 58, Della said softly. 20 years ago, there was a wreck. A car went off the road and rolled and caught fire. There was a woman in it and her little girl, and a man on a motorcycle stopped. He was the only one who stopped. Everybody else just drove past the flames, but he stopped." Diesel couldn't breathe, he remembered. God help him, he remembered every second of it. He'd been running from something himself that night, riding too fast in the dark, and he'd come over a rise and seen the fire. He'd pulled a woman out first, and she was hurt bad, hurt past saving, and he'd gone back in through the smoke and pulled out a little girl, maybe 6 years old, and carried her clear. And the woman, dying in the dirt with her daughter screaming, had grabbed his wrist. "Take care of her," she'd said. "Please tell her." And she'd pressed her St. Christopher medallion into his hand because she couldn't get the words out, and then she was gone. He'd put the medallion around the little girl's neck. He'd sat with her in the dirt until the ambulance came, this hardened outlaw holding a stranger's child and telling her over and over that she was safe now, that somebody had her, that she wasn't alone. And when they took her away to the hospital, into the system, he'd ridden off into the dark and told himself he'd done all he could do. He'd carried that little girl's face for 20 years. It was the one good thing in a life full of bad ones. The one thing he held onto when the dark got too heavy. "That was you," he whispered. That was you. I never forgot you." Della was crying openly now and smiling through it. "I was 6 years old and my whole world burned down, and a scary man on a motorcycle carried me out of the fire and held me and told me I'd be okay. You were the last good thing that happened to me before everything got hard. I grew up in foster homes, Wade, bounced around, hard years, and through every single one of them I had this." She held the medallion. "And I had the memory of the one person who ever stopped for me. I spent years looking for you. I asked around every biker bar and every diner on every road my mother ever drove. And this spring, an old mechanic told me there was a silver-bearded angel who took his coffee black at a diner off the 58 out past Barstow and had a 3-legged dog." She laughed and wiped her face. "I took the job the next week. I've been standing across that counter from you for 4 months, working up the nerve, trying to figure out how to tell the man who saved my life that I found him, that I never stopped being grateful. That when I said you were perfect, I meant it, because to a scared little girl in a burning car, you were the closest thing to an angel that ever came." Diesel Coburn, 61 years old, who had never once in his life cried where another soul could see it, put his torn-up face in his torn-up hands and wept. She held him. The neon buzzed. Gunnar rested his gray muzzle on the old man's knee. And 30 years of wait, all the sins and the funerals and the loneliness and the certainty that a man like him didn't get to be loved, all of it broke apart and washed out of him right there on that diner stool, in the arms of the little girl he'd carried out of the fire and never known he'd get to see again. They never did call the sheriff that night. The 3 men were long gone, and Diesel wasn't in any hurry to explain himself to the law, and Della decided some things were better handled between the people they happened to. She locked up the diner, and she drove him back to his little house on the county road in her old truck, with Gunnar in the middle of the bench seat and the motorcycle left behind to be fetched in the morning. She stayed. Not that night, not like that. She slept on his couch and made sure he didn't have a concussion, and in the morning she made eggs in his kitchen, and it was the first time in longer than he could remember that the house didn't feel too quiet and too empty. It felt like something. It felt like a start. The ribs healed slow, the way things do at 61. The cut over his eye left one more scar to add to the collection, a thin white line through his eyebrow. He didn't mind it. He said it was the only one he'd ever been proud of. Word got around, the way it does on those roads, that the diner off the 58 was under Diesel Coburn's protection now, and that the young waitress there was something to him, family in some way nobody quite understood. Nobody bothered her again. Not the meth crews, not the drifters, not anybody. The most feared man on the highway had drawn a line around one small diner and one small girl, and everybody with any sense stayed on the right side of it. But here's the part that surprised the people who thought they knew him. He got softer, not harder. Della had cracked something open in him that never closed back up. He started talking to people. He'd sit at that counter and actually swap stories with the truckers. He fixed the diner's busted sign and repaved the pothole in the lot and taught the busboy how to change his own oil. The town that had crossed the street to avoid him for 30 years slowly, cautiously, decided that maybe the old ghost wasn't a ghost after all. Just a man who'd been alone too long. He walked Della down the aisle 2 years later. Not as a father exactly, though it was close enough that neither of them cared about the word. She married a good young man who worked at the auto shop and treated her like she hung the moon, and Diesel stood up front in a suit that fit him wrong and a beard trimmed for the occasion. And when the preacher asked who gives this woman, Diesel's voice cracked right down the middle just like it had that rainy night, and he said, "I do. I found her once. I'm not letting her go now." There wasn't a dry eye in the place. Even the bikers cried, and bikers don't cry. Gunnar made it to see the wedding. The old three-legged shepherd who'd known before anybody, who'd thumped his tail under a diner stool the first time Della leaned close, lay in the shade at the reception with a bow tie somebody had put on him and let all the kids climb over him. He passed that winter in his sleep on the rug by the fire, with Diesel's hand on his side. They buried him out behind the house under a Joshua tree, and Diesel didn't ride for a week. Della's first child, a girl, they named after her mother, the woman from the wreck, the one who'd pressed a medallion into a stranger's hand and asked him to make sure her daughter was okay. Diesel held that baby the day she was born, this enormous scarred old outlaw cradling something so small, and Della watched him and remembered being 6 years old and carried out of the fire in those same arms. And she understood that the circle her mother had started that night on Route 58 had finally, after 20-some years, come all the way around and closed. You want to know what makes a man like that go soft? That's your answer. It was never softness at all. It was a debt he didn't know he was owed, paid back by a girl who never forgot the one time somebody stopped. Diesel lived a lot of years after that. Good ones. The best of his life, he'd tell you, and he lived them in the desert he'd always roamed, except now he wasn't roaming. He was home. He kept taking his coffee at that same diner, at that same stool, except now the girl refilling his cup called him Grandpa, and the old man who'd been feared on those roads for 30 years would smile down at her. This man nobody had ever beaten, undone at last and forever by the simplest thing in the world. Somebody had been kind to him, and it turned out that was the one thing he could never fight his way out of. He never wanted to. The medallion, that little tarnished St. Christopher, Della gave it back to him on his last birthday, said it had done its job, said he'd been her patron saint of travelers all along, the man who stopped on the road when nobody else would. He wore it after that, tucked under his cut over his heart, right up until the end. And that's the story of the old Hell's Angel who was told he was too broken to be loved, and the girl who leaned across a counter in the pink neon light and told him, "To me, you're perfect." She was right. She'd always been right. It just took him a lifetime and a fire and 30 years to believe her.